The wind came first. It rolled in from the channel like a warning no one could translate. Cold, salt-heavy, it whispered through the iron bones of ships. It moved through the narrow streets of a city. This city had not yet learned its fate. London breathed in that wind without knowing it carried the scent of fire. There were no sirens yet, no flames. Only the quiet unease that lingers before a storm that does not belong to nature. In those early hours, the war was still a map. Lines were drawn across Europe. Arrows pointed west, spreading like an infection. But maps are merciful. They flatten fear. They silence screams. Reality had not yet arrived, but it was coming. Somewhere in the corridors of power, footsteps echoed against polished stone. Decisions weighed more than bombs. A man stood at the threshold of something history would never fully understand. He had not yet spoken the words that would define him. He had not yet chosen. But the choice was already closing in. France was collapsing.
Paris, that eternal city of light, dimmed without a fight. And across the channel, Britain watched. There is a moment in every war when illusion dies. For Britain, that moment arrived not with explosions, but with silence. The silence of realization. The understanding that the continent was gone. Alliances, treaties, and promises, everything between them and the abyss had been swept away. The army had barely escaped. Dunkirk was not a victory. It was survival, dressed as a miracle. Boats of every kind, military vessels, fishing trawlers, pleasure, yachts crossed the water. They came not to conquer, but to retrieve fragments of a nearly lost army. Men stood shoulder to shoulder on the beaches. They waited not for orders, but for a way out. They left behind everything. Guns, tanks, vehicles, pride. What returned to Britain was not an army ready to fight. It was an army that had seen the face of annihilation and barely stepped away. And now, the island stood alone. The German war machine did not pause. It did not question. The German war machine moved with the terrifying certainty of something that had not yet been stopped. It was a relentless force. Poland had fallen. Norway had fallen. Belgium, the Netherlands, France all gone. Each victory fed the next, building momentum into something that felt unstoppable, inevitable. Across the channel, invasion plans were already forming. Operation Sea Lion.
The name sounded almost mythic, but there was nothing mythical about what it meant. Barges, troops, aircraft. A crossing not of exploration, but of conquest. For the first time in centuries, Britain faced the possibility of invasion. And inside the government, fear took a different shape. It wore suits. It spoke in measured tones. It did not shout, it reasoned. There were those who believed the war was already lost. Not out of cowardice, but calculation. They looked at the map. They counted the divisions. They understood the imbalance. Germany stood dominant over Europe. Britain stood alone. Its army was weakened. Its allies gone. Its skies were soon to be contested. This force had already proven its superiority. To them, the conclusion was clear. Negotiate. Not surrender, not yet. But seek terms. Preserve what could be preserved. Avoid destruction. Live to rebuild another day. It was not an irrational thought. Empires are not sustained by emotion. They are sustained by survival. And survival seemed to demand compromise. The meetings were quiet, no shouting, no grand speeches, just men around a table, each carrying the weight of a future they could not see clearly. Maps lay before them. Reports arrived hourly. Every piece of information reinforced the same truth. Britain stood at the edge of something it might not survive. And in the center of it all sat Winston Churchill.
He was not the obvious choice for leadership. He carried failures, Gallipoli, political exile, years spent warning about a threat few wanted to acknowledge. He was seen by many as impulsive, outdated, too willing to embrace conflict. But now, in a moment when caution threatened to become surrender, he represented something different. Not certainty, but defiance. Churchill understood what others did not grasp, not strategy but something deeper. He understood that this was not merely a war of territory, it was a war of will. If Britain chose negotiation now, it would not simply be ending a conflict. It would be accepting a world reshaped by force, a world where survival came at the cost of submission, a world where the future belonged to those who conquered, not those who endured. And once that choice was made, it could never be undone. The pressure mounted. Messages came through intermediaries, subtle, indirect, but unmistakable. There were ways to talk, ways to avoid the worst, ways to preserve the empire, at least in part. All it required was a willingness to listen. In another time, perhaps, such offers would have been considered pragmatic, but this was not another time. This was the moment when everything balanced on a single decision, and Churchill felt it, not as an abstract responsibility, but as something physical, a weight that pressed against the chest, that lingered in sleepless nights, that turned every quiet moment into a confrontation with consequence. He walked through the halls of power. He knew his choice would echo beyond his lifetime. He was not choosing for himself, he was choosing for a nation, for generations not yet born, for a future that could not speak. Outside, London continued its routines. Buses ran, shops opened. People moved through streets that still stood intact. There was tension, yes, but also a strange normalcy. The human mind resists catastrophe until it can no longer be denied. Children played, men read newspapers, women queued for food. Life persisted, even as the horizon darkened. But beneath it all, something was shifting. The skies would soon change. The silence would soon break. And before that happened, a decision had to be made. The meetings grew more intense.
Smoke and silence filled the room. Arguments sharpened as history hung in the balance. Voices remained controlled, but the stakes rose with every passing hour. Some insisted that refusing negotiation was reckless and risked total destruction. Leadership, they argued, required not just courage, but prudence. Others remained deeply uncertain, caught in the painful gap between their fear and their pride. Churchill listened in silence, never once dismissing their grave concerns. He understood their reasoning. He felt the same fear. He knew the cost of what he was considering. This was not a choice between safety and danger. It was a choice between two different forms of ruin, submission or annihilation. But there was a third possibility, not guaranteed or even likely, but possible. Resistance, not because it promised victory, but because it preserved something that surrender could not, the right to choose one's own fate. The moment came without ceremony, with no dramatic announcement or audience. Just a decision made in a room where history often moves without witnesses. Churchill chose to stand alone, rejecting negotiation and refusing to open the door to compromise. Britain might have been spared immediate suffering, but its future would be chained to another power. It was not a decision made with certainty of success. It was made with acceptance of risk, of fire, of loss, of a war that would now come directly to British soil. And when he spoke to the nation, his words carried not comfort, but truth. There would be no easy path, no quick resolution, only struggle, only endurance. Only the promise that whatever came, they would face it standing. The response was not immediate. There was no instant surge of confidence. People listened and absorbed. And slowly, something began to take hold. Not optimism, but resolve.
In 1940, the sky darkened. It was not from clouds. Terrifying silhouettes of aircraft filled the air. The Luftwaffe came in waves. Engines roared across the channel. Shadows swept over the fields below. The sirens began to wail. It was a rising, piercing sound. It defined an era of survival. People moved quickly to the shelters. Lights went out. The city prepared for something it could only endure. And then the bombs fell. Explosions shattered the buildings. They shattered the last illusions of safety. Fire spread. Smoke filled the air. Streets with centuries of history burned in hours. The city did not break. People emerged from shelters. They were covered in dust but alive. They helped each other in the dark. They dug through the hot rubble. They carried the wounded. Life continued on. It was not safe or easy, but the people knew it had to. Night after night, the bombers returned. The Blitz was a cycle of attack. Fear was met with defiance. Sleep became fragmented. Days blurred into nights. Against all odds, the city of London stood. Churchill walked through the ruins. He was a witness to broken homes. He saw lives interrupted. There was no illusion left. This was the price. He saw something else in the smoke. He saw people who had lost everything. They were standing anyway. They endured with unbreakable spirit. It was not a dramatic display. It was quiet and steady. In the end, it was unbreakable.
The Battle of Britain unfolded above them. In the skies, a different kind of war raged. Pilots climbed into aircraft, knowing that survival was uncertain. The air was filled with the sound of engines, the flash of gunfire. The sudden violence of encounters that lasted minutes, but decided everything. They fought not for conquest, but for time. Every enemy aircraft shot down delayed the invasion. Every sortie mattered. The odds were uneven, but the defense held. Radar stations tracked incoming waves. Command centers directed fighters. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance began to shift. Losses mounted on both sides. But the Luftwaffe could not achieve what it needed. Air superiority remained out of reach. The invasion, once imminent, became uncertain. And uncertainty, in war, is often the beginning of failure. Days turned into weeks. The attacks continued. But something had changed. The certainty that had driven the German advance across Europe was no longer present. For the first time, resistance had not collapsed. It had held, and in that holding, something fundamental shifted. The myth of invincibility cracked. Operation Sea Lion was postponed. The invasion never came. Not because Britain was stronger, but because it had refused to yield. And that refusal altered the course of everything that followed. The war did not end, far from it. Greater battles lay ahead, greater losses, greater horrors. But the moment had passed, the point at which everything could have ended differently. The day Churchill chose to stand alone did not guarantee victory. It guaranteed struggle. But it also preserved possibility. And in war, possibility is everything. Years later, when the guns finally fell silent, when the smoke cleared, and as the world finally began to rebuild, that monumental decision remained. Not as a simple act of defiance, but as a reminder that history does not always turn on strength. Sometimes, it turns on the willingness to endure when endurance seems impossible. The wind still moves across the channel. It carries no bombs now. No sirens follow it. But if one listens closely, beneath the quiet, there is an echo. Not of victory, but of a moment when a nation stood at the edge of darkness and chose not to step back, but to remain. And in that choice, changed the fate of the world.